From my early childhood days, I knew intuitively that I was letting people down. I really tried hard, but nothing seemed to work. Therefore, you can imagine everyone's surprise when not only did I get into a top medical school, but somehow managed to complete it too. After graduating in medicine came the dilemma: what do I specialize in? After much discussion and anguish, I chose psychiatry, to most people's surprise and disdain. I remember my Didima, my favorite grandparent, exclaiming with deep disappointment, "After all these years of hard work, is that all you could think of becoming? A pagolit doctor? A doctor for the mad?" The stigma and shame around mental illness was deep and continues to be after all these years. Yet I held on, as there was something about mental health that really intrigued me, perhaps due to my own brush with it. While training in psychiatry, I gravitated naturally towards child and adolescent mental health. Working with children and their families, I discovered the joy of being unpretentious and spontaneous again. But what struck me the most was their uncanny knack of holding a mirror to the adult world, where we could see our own values and double standards, our dreams and disappointments, as well as our challenges and failings. It was in the so-called naughty kids that I saw my reflection, particularly the ones that are bouncing off the wall and getting into trouble at home, school, or the playground, who ever so often were written off by the world. I saw my troubled childhood in their eyes, my angst-ridden adolescence in their words. I'd grown up hearing my childhood stories told and retold with a combination of despair and amusement by my family. As a toddler, how my mother had to tie me with a sari, otherwise I would run away, or how I was ready to take risky chances from an early age. I have experienced being the invisible child in a classroom due to my struggles with academics, or being singled out as a failure. Knowing these kids was like coming back a full circle. It struck me that very much like some of the kids I was treating, I too had ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But just like I had resisted being slotted into a single story of being only a troublemaker, I could not allow these kids to slip into a single story of ADHD. In my life, I was lucky to find people who could see me in a more wholesome way and keep faith in my abilities. And that is how I wanted to help the kids I saw, not slot them into problem-saturated boxes, but create spaces for them to be seen, heard, and to find richer stories for them. And for that to happen, I had to see them through different lenses, and not just through the traditional lens of mental illness and treatment. And in this journey of being not just a psychiatrist, but an advocate for children, I picked up different lenses on the way, which I want to share with you today, and reflect on why it may be important for all of us. The first lens I discovered quite early was that do not write off people who develop a so-called mental illness. They are much more than a cluster of symptoms and label. Indeed, they carry many other stories that can make their lives much richer and meaningful if they find a space to tell them. I remember 17-year-old Ajay, who had come from a small town in central India. He had been labeled as a psychotic patient and was taking 8 different medicines in a day. He had dropped out of school, could barely step out of home, had lost all connection with friends and cousins, had put on weight, and had recently started losing control over his bowels. He was virtually written off by his school, his so-called friends, and extended family. That's when his parents decided to bring him to the child psychiatry department of an institute in Bangalore, where he was admitted for the next couple of months. The first thing our treating team decided to do was to take him off all medication and observe. And what emerged was refreshing, as Ajay started moving and talking more freely, expressing his desires and hopes about school and college with less fear, catching us by surprise with his sense of humor, getting excited about his session and his passion in cricket and wanting to reconnect with his friends. And suddenly, the human being and teenager in Ajay came alive. Although Ajay did eventually get a diagnosis which needed treatment, he and his family went back home with hope and possibilities of a future for him. My second lens We cannot hold young people responsible for their mental health struggles, which so often shows up as difficult behaviors. Instead, we all need to come together to take collective responsibility. This lens came to me in the next phase of my journey. In an attempt to train further in child and adolescent mental health and to experience the workings of the world outside India, my wife, Shailaja, and I took off to work in the UK in the mid-90s and stayed there for the next 8 years, working for the NHS, the National Health Service. Though the NHS has its own struggles and challenges, we learned how social structures can be created for the best interest of the child. I saw how care can be rooted in the community with schools, social work, child protection services, even police and responsible citizens can come together to look after their troubled young people. Another thing that changed our lives forever while we were in England was having our children. First Nishat and then Anya. They filled our lives with excitement and meaning, but challenges too, as they added an additional lens, a mirror, another mirror. Yes, it is not easy when you are surrounded by children at work and at home. They have sensitive radars for bullshit and hypocrisy. I believe that our children helped us grow and realize even more that we had to do something to make this world a better place for our own and other children to thrive. With that determination, we returned to India with a single-minded purpose of developing child and adolescent mental health services, CAMS in short, to which I'll refer to now and then. Friends and well-wishers advised us not to put all our eggs in one basket, as a society, they said, was not ready for it yet. Some told us that children in India did not have mental health problems and that child abuse only happened in the West. But we stuck to our child-friendly guns doggedly. And in 2004, under the aegis of a welcoming multi-speciality hospital, we started the first dedicated CAMS in Delhi. Within 2 years, we were struggling to cope with the deluge of referrals despite our growing multidisciplinary team. In another couple of years, we were bursting at the seams in the limited space the hospital could provide us. And so in 2009, we took a leap of faith to break away and form Children First, an organization looking after the mental health needs of children and adolescents placed within the community this time. I believe that Children First was waiting to happen. The gaping needs of young people in today's times was demanding it. It was not surprising, therefore, that in the next 10 years, it became one of the biggest standalone facilities for CAMS in India. And it also evolved in ways that we couldn't foresee, which came from our responses to the children and families we met and the interface with the larger community. And it is in this context and experiences within it that I picked up another two lenses. Take the case of 15-year-old Sahil, a bright and talented young man who had started hating school and studies since he came to middle school. A voracious reader, a deep thinker, he would question everything, especially the education system. Parents and teachers had given up on him as he was bunking classes, failing in exams, arguing with teachers and disrupting the class with his so-called rude and defiant behaviors. And more recently, worryingly, he started experimenting with substances of abuse. But Sahil was not always like this, As a younger child, he was a curious and imaginative, playful and affectionate, and wrote exceptional poetry. Although a quick learner and clear with his concepts, he was a dreamer in class and would often struggle to complete academic work both in school and at home. Things had clearly become much more complicated by the time he came to see us. Sahil was diagnosed with ADHD, and it was evident with a lot of his angst and aggression was in response to the judgment and criticism that were thrown at him from middle school onwards, a time when school becomes increasingly uncompromising with studies and academics. He was on the verge of slipping into depression or serious substance misuse had it not been for the timely intervention. One can imagine how his story could have been so different had his parents and teachers recognized that he was wired differently and responded to his talents and abilities rather than his failings. Or consider the story of 12-year-old Shahnaz, who was brought by the police to a reputed NGO that I work with closely, along with her 10-year-old sister. Shahnaz now had disclosed that her stepfather had been sexually abusing her repeatedly after their mother's death from the time she was 9 years old. She had kept quiet till she noticed that this man's roving eyes were increasingly falling on his other growing daughter. And Shahnaz could no longer bear the thought of the impending doom that was awaiting her little sister. The man was promptly sent to jail under the stringent law of POCSO, which is the Prevention of Child Sexual Offences Act in India. And the extended family saw Shahnaz's act of care towards her sister as selfishness and blamed her for breaking the family and denounced both the children. Shahnaz and her sister were accepted and nurtured in the NGO and settled well in their new home over the next few months. Till Shahnaz was taken for a mandatory visit to the state-run CWC, or Child Welfare Committee, which is meant to take care of children's welfare, as the name would suggest. But instead, they questioned her motive and admonished her for bringing disrepute to the family. Shahnaz plunged into depression. Plagued with guilt, she made a serious suicidal attempt and started getting disturbing nightmares and flashbacks from the days of abuse by her own father. It took her many months to recover from the tormenting symptoms and for healing to begin. It was ironical that Shahnaz's attempts at saving her little sister from sexual abuse provoked such extreme reaction from adults around her. The same adults who would be expected to protect her damaged her further. Working with children like Sahil and Shahnaz gave me my third lens. I realized that children can be wired and inspired differently. And some might have the propensity of developing mental health difficulties under stress. But it is the reaction of adults and the world we have created around them that makes it much more complicated and damaging for them. I have so often seen that in our apathy and the callous responses of our institutions that drive our young people to despair and disruptive or even dangerous behaviors. And then, last year, COVID-19 happened, which demolished some of the foundations of our society that were cracking up already. We were all impacted by it, but it was the youth that bore the brunt of this brutal blow. Suddenly, mental health became a crisis, and we were overwhelmed with stories of despair and death. At Children First, we responded by starting a brief therapy service for young adults. Hundreds of isolated young people started reaching out to us for help, cut off from families and friends with little access to activities and spaces that breathe life and meaning into our existence. Many lost their fledgling jobs, and others could not go to college as they had planned. What struck us was that so many of them were considered capable, well-adjusted, and successful young people before the pandemic took away all freedom and agency from their lives. My fourth lens came from this realization that mental health problems do not in any way indicate that people are damaged, broken, or weak. Given the same context and circumstances, any of us would respond in the same way. In summary, I would like to emphasize, it is not abnormal to feel despair and hopelessness or to develop symptoms of anxiety or depression when you're completely isolated from family and friends and have no certainty about the future, as so many young people did in the pandemic lockdown. It is not unusual to lash out with words, become rebellious, and start taking dangerous chances, like Sahil did, when you're judged, criticized, and marginalized for having difficulties in learning. And isn't it amazing that a 12-year-old gathered the courage to take a definitive stand to protect her younger sister from a sexual predator? And it is understandable when she crumbles in the face of shaming and ostracization for those very acts of courage and starts getting terrifying nightmares of the sexual abuse she suffered as a child, like Shahnaz did. It is indeed the norm, both functionally and statistically, to go through mental health struggles at some time in our lives, just like we all go through physical health or financial troubles. It is therefore vital that we begin to accept it as an integral part of our lives, become more aware and equipped to deal with it. So, bringing together my four lenses. Number one, do not write off people who develop a so-called mental illness. They are much more than a cluster of symptoms and labels. Indeed, they carry many more stories that can make their lives much richer and meaningful if they are provided a safe space to tell them. We cannot, and that's number two, we cannot hold young people responsible for their mental health struggles, which so often shows up as difficult behaviors. Instead, we all need to come together to take collective responsibility. Number 3, young people can be wired and inspired differently, and some might have the propensity of developing mental health difficulties under stress. But it is the reaction of adults and the world we have created around them that makes it much more complicated and damaging for them. Number 4, mental health problems do not in any way indicate that people are damaged, broken, or weak. Given the same context and circumstances, any one of us could respond in the same way. The pandemic has jolted humanity and made us question the way we have treated nature and our environment, and has raised doubts about the meaning of success, the institutions that define it, and our mindless pursuit of the material. It has also given us an opportunity to reconsider our priorities in terms of mental health and well-being. But the question is, how much of our mind space and resources are we willing to devote to it in the so-called new normal? Each one of us can be a catalyst for this change. So I have one thing to say to you. Whether you are a parent, a teacher, mental health worker, a young activist, or just a person who cares, together we can create a movement for our children and youth. Are you ready for it?